Hello and welcome back to another full step-by-step PC build guide, and today I'm going to be showing you how to build a PC in the latest case from APNX. This is the V1. If you see any parts you like, you'll find links to all these parts in the description. So as usual, let's make a start by taking a detailed look at the case. Okay, so we've got a dual chamber case with tempered glass on the front and on the side. But rather than having our other side panel completely flat, we've got this angled side panel. And if we take a look in at the top of the case, you can see the reason this panel is this particular shape. It's to improve the airflow in the case. So in a traditional case, the airflow would come in at 90 degrees, and then there would be quite a bit of turbulence before it would go towards the back of the case. The idea of it coming in here at 45 degrees, it should be a smoother path into your main components, avoiding turbulence, hopefully giving you better cooling and less noise. If we take a look at our top I/O, we've got a power button, there's two USB Type A ports, a single Type C port, and a combined headphone and microphone jack. And then just behind our power button, we've got this little button here, which is an LED controller button, and you can plug that into an ARGB controller to cycle through the effects. To remove our case's top panel, there's a handle at the back, and we can simply lift the panel up to remove it from the case. And you'll notice our top panel has integrated mesh to act as a dust filter. You'll notice we've got these warning stickers on our side panels. They're both held on with security screws. And we've got a single screw holding each of our side panels in place. After you've done your build, replacing these screws is optional. With the security screws removed at the top, we can simply pull our side panel out from the top and then lift up and away. And our other side panel is removed in exactly the same way. And if we take a look at the other side panel, you notice we've got a removable dust filter. To remove our angle panel, you can get your hand underneath and then just pull away. Again, if we take a look at the back of this panel, we've got a removable dust filter. So the case itself comes in a variety of color options. I've got the black and white version, but it does also come in all black or all white. And again, you can get this angle panel to match your case or in a wood effect. This is what the black panel looks like, and it is one of the cheapest options. And I do think it actually goes better than the wooden panel with this black and white case. For most builds, you probably don't need to remove this front tempered glass panel, but I will show you how to do it for completeness. It's held on with two screws at the side. And you're then going to be able to slide the panel towards the side, and this is going to allow you to pull it forward to remove it. On the bottom of the case, we've got a large tray-style dust filter which can simply be pulled out from the side. In terms of fan and radiator mounting options, at the top, the side and the bottom, you're going to be able to mount up to three 120 or two 140mm fans, or up to a 360 or 280mm radiator. We do have additional mounting options on the side, and here you are going to be able to mount up to two 160mm fans. While the important thing to mention at the bottom, if you want to go with a 280mm radiator, you are going to have the motherboard installed in the top position. More on that later on. While at the rear of the case is up to a single 120mm fan or radiator. Our top fan stroke radiator bracket is held on with 6 screws, and then the bracket can simply be lifted up and away. And our bracket at the bottom is held on with a thumb screw at the front. Once that's removed, we can push the bracket backwards, tilt it up and lift away. There's 3 thumb screws holding on our side bracket, and then we can remove the bracket. So out of the box, the front bracket is set up for mounting 120mm fans. As I've mentioned, this is the only place you're able to install 160mm fans. To do this, you're going to have to remove these 2 rails. They're each held on with 2 screws, one at the top and one at the bottom. And that's then going to give you access to the holes for mounting 160mm fans. So you'll notice we've got 2 holes here, so if you're wanting to go with 140mm fans, rather than installing the bracket in this position, we can slide it all the way to the end, and I would do the same on the other side. You're now going to be set up for 140mm fans. So in terms of motherboard support, the case supports motherboards up to ATX in size, and if you want to go with a CPR cooler, the maximum height supported is 170mm. So I have mentioned it is possible to install the motherboard in 2 different positions. Out of the box, it's installed in the lower position, where we've got 47.5mm of space below the motherboard and 82.2mm of space above the motherboard. And in the higher position, the space above the motherboard is going to be reduced down to 61.9mm, but you do increase the space below the motherboard to 67.8mm, and that is going to allow you to mount a 240mm radiator at the bottom. So if you did want to do this, the first step would be moving all the standoffs up to the row above, and you can see we do have 2 rows of standoffs. In the case accessory box, you get the standoff insertion and removal tool. It's going to go over the standoffs. You're then going to be able to use a screwdriver to move the standoffs. So that's our standoffs moved to the upper position. You see we've got the up arrow for the upper position, the low arrow for the lower position. A is for ATX motherboard and M is for a micro ATX motherboard. So the last thing we're going to need to do to move the motherboard to the higher position, it's now going to be sitting up here and there'll be a gap at the bottom. So we've got this little cover which was originally at the top and we need to move it to the bottom. We can tilt it out slide it into the little clip at the bottom and secure it into place with a thumb screw. So you'll see now our motherboard in the higher position will fill this gap. In terms of graphics card support, we've got 7 horizontal PCI expansion slot brackets at the back, and the case will support graphics cards up to a maximum length of 395mm. And we've got a built-in GPU support bracket to help support your graphics card. So in terms of height, it's going to go up and down, these 2 thumb screws to control that. And we've also got a thumb screw at the top, which if we loosen, we're going to be able to slide the bracket in a whole variety of different positions. So you should be able to get this in a good position to support your graphics card. If we move around to our case's second compartment, we've got this drive storage bracket at the bottom, which is held on with 2 screws. And it's actually on a door, so we're now able to swing it out. And that's going to give you access to the back of the case. Although this bracket is actually removable, and once you've removed the 2 screws, you can simply lift it up to remove it. So in this bracket, you're able to mount up to 2 3.5-inch drives with 4 2.5-inch drives, or up to a total of 6 2.5-inch drives. So you'll see at the bottom, we have this little lip, and this is where you're going to set your 3.5-inch drive. So it's simply going to sit on here. And then if we turn the bracket around, you'll notice that the holes are labeled. So we've got H here for hard drive. So you're going to take the bag of screws labeled 3.5-inch hard drives, and you've got cutouts here to secure your 3.5-inch drive in place. If you're going with a 2.5-inch drive, you can see we've got holes here. So you're going to set your drive into place. Again, line it up with a little bracket on this side. And then if we turn things around, you'll notice we've got these holes here labeled S. And you're going to be able to use the labeled 2.5-inch drive screws to secure your drive in place. So on the other side of the bracket, it's exactly the same process. You're either able to set a 3.5-inch drive or a 2.5-inch drive into place and screw it in on this side in exactly the same way. So as I mentioned, it is important to secure this drive first of all, whether you're going with a 3.5-inch or 2.5-inch drive. I'll just set it out of the way temporarily to show you how we're going to install the other 2.5-inch drives. So with this drive in place, all you're going to do is take your other 2.5-inch drives, slot them in from the side and push them all the way to the end. And we can have one here and another one below it. And then if we turn things around, you'll notice the drive holes are lining up with the holes here. So again, you're going to use the 2.5-inch drives to secure these into place. And then you can see your drive connections are going to be coming out here. And then again, on the other side of the bracket, it's exactly the same. You're going to have one drive here, but you're still going to be able to slot 2 2.5-inch drives in from the end. So in terms of cable routing space, this looks to be really good at 90mm. We've got loads of Velcro cable straps to help organize our cables, as well as additional cable tie-down points. And our power supply is going to sit up here in this shelf. The case is compatible with full-sized ATX power supplies up to a maximum length of 220mm. So one additional thing that APNX have sent out for this build is this fan and ARGB controller, and it has 10 ports for PWM and 10 ports for ARGB, which is really going to simplify this build. I'm not sure if they're going to be selling this separately with the case as an optional extra, but it should really simplify the building process. I'm going to go ahead and install this for this build. It will depend on the type of fans that you're installing and their connection, whether it is actually worth installing this, or whether you should just plug the fans directly into your motherboard. So in terms of the cables coming from it, we've got PWM and ARGB cables to plug into our motherboard, and that's then going to control everything that's plugged into the hub. To power the hub, we've got 2 SATA cables, and we're going to need to plug these into SATA power cables coming from our power supply. And importantly, if we look in at the ports of the hub, you notice we've got this white PWM port at the top, and it's important that we plug one of our fans into this port to allow the motherboard to read the fan speeds. If we take a look at our front panel cable, we've got the additional 2-pin LED button that we can plug into this controller to allow that button on the top of the case to cycle through the ARGB effects on the controller. So I'm just going to separate this cable from the rest of the front panel connectors. And we've got a 2-pin connector on the side of the hub we can plug this into. Then we can set our controller up into place with a cutout on the back of the case, and we'll screw it into place using the 2 included screws. So this does look to be a really nice option. As far as I'm aware, this doesn't come as standard with the case. I think it's only been sent out to reviewers. I really do hope they offer it as an optional extra because it will really simplify the building process. Okay, so we can go ahead and open our CPU socket by pushing this lever down, bring it all the way to the middle of the motherboard, and then we can open the socket cover up. We can then lower our CPU down into the socket gently, holding it by the edges. We'll give it a little bit of a wiggle from side to side and top to bottom to check it's properly sitting in the socket. Once we're happy it is, we're going to go ahead and close the socket cover down again. and then we'll close the lever, and as we do, the black bit of plastic will pop off, and we'll put it in our motherboard box for safekeeping. I'm going to install the M.2 SSD in the top slot, and the best thing about this motherboard installation is going to be completely toolless. So we can push this little lever over to the side, which is going to free up our heatsink. If you do get the motherboard from new, you're going to have some plastic protection on this heat pad, and also on the back of the heatsink that you're going to need to remove. Then we can install our M.2 SSD into the slot, and if we flatten it down, this little clip is going to hold it in place. And then all we need to do is replace our heatsink. Next, we've got our RAM, which we're going to be installing in the second and fourth slot along from the CPU. So we'll open the clips on these slots. Then we just need to line the RAM up with the slot. Once we're happy it's lined up correctly, we can just apply some pressure and it's going to clip into place. To install the brackets for our CPU cooler, we're going to need to remove the stock clips. They're each held on with 2 screws. And then we've got one of these thumb screws to go onto each corner. We can then insert our motherboard into the case, lining it up with the standoffs at the back, and then we'll secure it into place using 9 of the motherboard screws from the case accessory box. So you'll notice our top M.2 SSD heatsink is blocking access to the middle screw, so we'll need to remove it temporarily. And then we can replace the heatsink. Next, we've got our case cables to plug in. Our HD audio cable is going to go into this header down the bottom left-hand side of the motherboard. So we can go ahead and bring it through the cutout, and we're going to plug it in with the HD audio text facing down the way. We've got 2 3-pin 5V ARGB headers next to that. So I'm going to bring the ARGB cable coming from my controller through and get it plugged in. We've then got some system fan headers at the bottom of the motherboard. So we'll bring the PWM cable coming from our fan hub through and plug it into one of the headers. Now, if you're not using a fan hub, you can just plug your fans into the motherboard at the right time. Our front panel connectors are going to go into the left-hand side of this header at the bottom right-hand side of the motherboard, and we're going to plug it in with the front panel text facing up the way. We've then got our USB 3.2 Gen 1 header, so we'll bring our cable through the cutout, line it up with the header, and push into place. Our front panel Type-C cable is going to go into this header here, so we'll bring it through the cutout, line it up with the header, and push into place. So I've installed our motherboard in the high position. Now, one thing I'm noticing is that there is quite a big gap between these cables running up to the bottom of the motherboard. The reason I've done this is I'm planning on installing my graphics card in the vertical position, so I'm trying to not to hide as much of the motherboard as possible. I do think though, if you're going with a horizontal GPU, I don't really like the look of this, and I think you would be better with your motherboard in the default bottom position. We're now ready to install our power supply, and I've gone ahead and plugged in the cables that we're going to need. So I plugged in our 24-pin motherboard cable, 2 8-pin EPS cables to provide additional power to our CPU, a SATA power cable to power our fan and ARGB hub and also our AIO, and I plugged in a 12-volt high power cable to power our graphics card. And then we can secure it into place using 4 of the power supply screws from the case accessory box. Our EPS cables are going to go into these 2 headers at the top left of the motherboard, so we can go ahead and bring them through the cutout and get them plugged in. And then we'll just pull all the excess cable through to the back. Our 24-pin cable is going to go into this header here, so we'll bring it through the cutout at the side, line it up with the motherboard, and push into place. And then we'll just pull all the excess cable through to the back. And then at the back of the case, we just need to plug the 2 SATA cables coming from our fan hub into the cable coming from our power supply. We're now ready to install our AIO, and it's great to see that our fans are pre-installed on the radiator. So all we're going to need to do is take our fan cable that comes in the box and push it into place in each fan. There's 3 different connectors on it. And then on the other end, we've got a 4-pin PWM cable. We're going to plug that into our CPU fan header on the motherboard. And then we've got a 3-pin 5V ARGB cable, and if we plug that into a header on our motherboard, it's going to allow us to control all the lighting. In terms of the cables coming from our pump, we've got this 3-pin cable we're going to plug into our pump header on the motherboard, and that's going to allow us to control the speed of the pump. We've got a 3-pin 5V ARGB cable, and again, we're going to plug that into a header on our motherboard. There's also a little splitter cable, so what we could do is plug the cable from our fans and the radiator into the splitter cable, meaning we only need 1 ARGB header on our motherboard. We've also got a SATA cable to power the pump, and we'll plug that into a SATA cable coming from our power supply. And then our last cable is a USB cable, and we plug that into a USB 2.0 header on our motherboard. That's going to allow us to control the effects on our pump screen. So this is our pump screen, and one really cool thing about this pump, it has a gyroscope built into it, so no matter what way you install it in your build, the screen is going to be up the right way. You can see we've got thermal paste pre-applied to the back of it, so we're just going to have to be careful we don't damage it during the installation. Next thing to do is install the brackets for our pump. So if you've got an Intel motherboard, you're going to use these brackets, and if you've got an AMD motherboard like we do, you're going to use these brackets here. If you're going with AMD, you're just going to have to be careful which way you put these brackets on, because they're not going to be symmetrical and it's only going to fit on the motherboard one way round. So I'm happy to have the tubes at the bottom, so I'm going to be installing it this way round. So we can go ahead and secure it into place using these small screws. Then we can set our case's top fan bracket into place, and we'll secure it into place using the short radiator screws. We can then lower our IO into place at the top, and then we can replace the 6 screws at the top. And we can then replace our case's top panel. Then I'm just going to line the pump with the bracket we've installed on the motherboard, and we just need to get a thumb screw onto each corner. And there's some plastic protection on the screen that we can remove. So our AIO has quite a lot of cables coming from the bottom of it. Normally I would route these up towards the top of the motherboard, but because I'm going to have a vertical GPU, I'm actually going to route these down towards the bottom where the cables are all going to be hidden. So I'm just going to remove the heat sinks for our M.2 SSDs. So wouldn't be my usual way of routing these cables down towards the bottom, but given the amount of cables that we have, and actually the fact we're going to have a vertical GPU, they're all going to be completely hidden, and we're not going to have any additional cables running up towards the top. So we do actually have a pump header down the bottom of the motherboard, so we'll plug the 3-pin pump cable into it. We've got a USB header at the bottom of the motherboard, so we'll plug the USB cable into it. And then I'm just going to pass all the rest of the cables through to the back. Our CPU fan header is this grey header at the top of the motherboard, so we'll plug the PWM cable coming from our fans and the radiator into it. And then we can just pass the ARGB cable through to the back. Then at the back of the case, we can daisy chain the ARGB cable from our fans and the radiator into the ARGB cable from our pump. And then we can plug it into one of the ARGB headers on our fan hub, or alternatively, if you prefer, you can plug it directly into an ARGB header on your motherboard. Last, we've got the SATA cable coming from our pump, which we can plug into the SATA cable coming from our power supply. Next, we can set 3 reverse blade fans onto our bottom fan bracket. We'll turn it over, and we can secure it into place using the screws that came with the fans. And we can install 3 standard blade fans onto our side fan bracket. Just before we set the bottom fan bracket into place, I'm going to pass all the cables through to the back, and then we can set the bracket into place. We'll pull it forward and secure it with the thumb screw. We can set our side fan bracket into place and secure it using the 3 thumb screws. And there's a little cutout just here to route all the cables through. Then we can replace the panel, and I much prefer the look of the black panel. We can set a standard blade 120mm fan into place at the back and secure into place with the 4 screws. Then at the back of the case, we just need to plug all the fan cables into our hub. So the cables aren't the easiest to plug in with the hub already installed, so I'm just going to free the hub up, plug the cables in, and then install the hub again at the end. We're now ready to install our graphics card, and as I've mentioned, I'm going to be using APNX's Vertical GPU Graphics Kit 2. So this comes with a Gen 5 riser cable, which I'm going to pass through this cutout, and then we can line it up with the standoffs at the bottom. We can then secure it into place using 2 of the smaller screws, and then we'll just make sure the clip on the slot is open. We can then line our graphics card up with the slot, and once we're happy we've got it lined up, if we just apply some firm pressure, it'll slot into place. And then we'll secure it into place using 2 of the thumb screws. To install our graphics card in the case, we're going to need to remove the expansion slot brackets. I think I'm going to be able to leave the top one in place, but I'm going to remove all the other ones. We can remove the plastic protection from the riser cable, and then I'm just going to set the graphics card loosely into the case and plug the riser cable into the motherboard. The other thing that's probably going to be easier at this stage is plugging the power cable into our graphics card. So we can bring our 12V type power cable through and plug it into place. And then we can just line the graphics card up with the brackets. And we can secure it into place at the side with the 3 small screws that came with the vertical GPU kit. Then we've just got some cable management at the back to do and get the panels back on again. Okay, so that's the build complete and looking great. If you don't know how to install Windows, the drivers, the RGB software, enter the BIOS, update the BIOS, and adjust all the BIOS settings, I've made a separate video that covers all of that, and I'll put a link to that video in the description. The only thing you won't get from that video is how to set up this particular IO, but I am going to make a separate guide for this IO, and I'm going to finish off with the software setup, so you'll find a link to that video in the description as well. So in terms of the temperatures, our Ryzen 7 9700X idled at 40 degrees and reached a maximum of 62 degrees during the 10-minute IDA64 stability test. Our Aorus Master RTX 4080 idled at 28 degrees and reached a maximum of 52 degrees during the stability test. In terms of noise, we had average noise levels of 36 decibels at idle and 55 decibels under load. So in terms of the temperatures, very happy with those. Noise levels under load were the only slight issue. They were a bit higher than what I would have been happy with, but given that the temperatures are so good, there's plenty of headroom to bring the maximum fan speeds all the way down to reduce those noises under load. So in terms of pricing, the all black version and the black and white version that I've got here with the black angle panel is going to set you back $130, whereas the all white version with the white angle panel is going to set you back an extra $10. And if you want to upgrade to the wooden angle panel, that's going to cost you an extra $20. So in terms of building the case, I didn't really run into any difficulties at all. Even with the motherboard in the upper position, there was loads of room at the top for a standard IO, and I was able to even to plug all the cables into the top of the motherboard without any difficulty. I don't think this would look quite as good with the graphics card in the horizontal position because there was quite a big gap with the cables running up to the bottom of the motherboard. So I think if I'm going with a horizontal graphics card, I probably would have the motherboard in the default lower position, whereas actually elevating the motherboard up meant you could see more of it behind our vertical GPU. So in terms of what I liked about the case, I think aesthetically it is a really good looking case. I love black and white as my favorite color theme. If you're a subscriber to the channel, you'll know that. So this black and white case works absolutely perfectly for me and looks great with all the RGB set to white. In terms of build quality, it's flawless throughout the case. I didn't really run into any issues at all. Cable management at the back is really, really good. There's loads of room and your cables are hid nicely away. And if you do want to go with lots of drives in this case, you're covered with up to 6 drives installed at the back in that nice removable bracket. In terms of the things I didn't like about the case, the only really thing I've got to say that given this case's price point, it is up towards the higher end, I do think that fan and ARGB hub should have been included in the case, particularly where you can mount up to 10 fans in this case, and that 10-port ARGB and fan hub would be really useful. So putting everything together, I can definitely recommend this case. Price is on the higher end, but I do think in terms of the build quality and the aesthetics of this case, you are getting what you pay for. It would just have been nice to have seen that fan and ARGB hub included in the price. Just remember the hidden cost. This is a showcase, so you are going to want to fill it with fans, and you could end up actually paying more for the fans than what you paid for this case. So putting the whole thing together, it's not going to be the cheapest, but very happy with the look of the build I've got at the end of it. And like I say, I can definitely recommend this case. If you have enjoyed this full step-by-step PC build guide, please remember to give it a thumbs up. And if you're not currently subscribed to the channel, please hit the subscribe button as well. Thanks for watching.